I thought my brother was my protector. Until one night, I realized he was my greatest threat. When I think back to my childhood, I see a picture of innocence. We weren't a perfect family, but we were happy in our own way. My brother Charlie and I were close. We were siblings, after all. I admired him. He was older, smarter, and seemed to know so much about the world. To me, he was the one person I could trust without question. Charlie wasn't the loudest or most outgoing person. He was quiet, a little reserved, but he had a way about him that made you feel safe. He was the kind of older brother who would help you with your homework or stand up for you if the neighborhood kids teased you. At least, that's who I thought he was. I remember the games we used to play. Hide and seek in the backyard, building forts out of blankets in the living room, and even just sitting together on rainy days, watching the water streak down the windows. There was a kind of unspoken bond between us, one I never questioned. But now, looking back, I wonder if I ever truly knew him at all. As kids, you don't notice the things that seem strange. Like the way Charlie would spend hours dissecting small animals he found in the yard. At the time, I thought it was curiosity, a sign of how smart he was. But there were moments, fleeting ones, that felt off. The way he'd stare too long, the way his voice would flatten when he talked about certain things. I brushed it off. He was my brother, my protector. Why would I think otherwise? Growing up, we shared everything, our secrets, our fears, our dreams. I trusted him with my life, as any little sister would. But trust can be a dangerous thing, especially when it blinds you to the truth. I never thought he was capable of such evil, but I was wrong. That night, the night it all changed, is etched into my memory like a scar that will never fade. I didn't see it coming. I couldn't have. How could I? Charlie was my brother, my family, and family is supposed to keep you safe. But that night, Charlie proved that family could also destroy you. I grew up in what most people would call a typical family. Our home wasn't perfect, but it was filled with love, or so I thought. My parents worked hard to provide for us, and Charlie and I, like most siblings, had our share of fights and laughter. But more than anything, I looked up to him. He was older, wiser, and had this quiet confidence about him that made me feel safe. He was the kind of person you'd imagine growing up to do something extraordinary. And I adored him. Charlie was a bright child, the kind who could spend hours reading books or working on projects in his room. He didn't need a lot of attention and wasn't the type to demand the spotlight. Instead, he found comfort in the little things. While other kids played outside or got into trouble, Charlie would sit quietly, lost in his own world. I admired that about him. He seemed to have this unshakable calm, this ability to stay grounded no matter what was happening around him. He had a knack for fixing things. Whether it was a broken toy or something as simple as a jammed door, Charlie always seemed to know what to do. I remember watching him once as he carefully took apart an old clock from the garage. His hands moved so precisely, his face focused and intense. To me, it was like magic. But there were other things I didn't think much of at the time, that now seem so much darker. Charlie had this fascination with how things worked, especially living things. It started small, catching bugs in jars, watching them crawl around, studying their every move. From there, it moved on to birds, squirrels, and even stray cats. He'd spend hours outside, his small tools spread out on the ground, carefully dissecting whatever he had caught that day. At the time, none of us thought much of it. My parents saw it as curiosity, maybe even intelligence. They used to joke that Charlie would grow up to be a doctor or a scientist, someone who would do great things. And I believed them. I wanted to believe them. But there were moments, quiet ones, that left me uneasy. Sometimes I'd catch him staring, not at me, but at something, or maybe nothing at all. It wasn't the kind of stare you'd expect from a kid. It was too intense, too focused, like he was working something out in his head that no one else could understand. Other times, he'd say things, offhand remarks that didn't feel quite right. I remember once, when we were playing in the backyard, I tripped and scraped my knee. I cried, as kids do, and expected Charlie to comfort me. Instead, he just looked at the blood running down my leg, his head tilted slightly, his eyes unblinking. He didn't say a word. He didn't rush to help. He just stared. It's funny how memory works. At the time, I brushed it off, just another odd moment in a childhood full of odd moments. But now, those little things, those fleeting moments of strangeness, feel like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't see before. Still, despite everything, I adored him. He was my big brother, my hero. When I had nightmares, it was Charlie I ran to, not my parents. He'd sit with me, his voice calm and steady, telling me stories until I fell asleep again. I trusted him in a way that only a little sister could. He was my protector, my guide, the person who was supposed to keep me safe. And I never doubted that. Not for a second. Even now, as I look back on those years, I wonder how much of what I remember is real and how much is colored by what came later. Was he always like that? Were the warning signs there, just waiting for someone to notice them? Or was I just a little girl who saw her brother as a hero because she didn't know any better? I wish I could go back, to that time before everything fell apart, before I realized that the person I trusted most in the world was capable of unimaginable darkness. But I can't. And that's what haunts me the most. I still remember the sound of the gunshot. It wasn't like in the movies, loud and dramatic. It was sharp, sudden, and so out of place in the quiet of our home that it froze me where I stood. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I was just a kid. What did I know about the sound of real violence? But then came the second shot, and the scream, my mother's scream. That was when the nightmare began. The house felt different that night, heavier somehow. Dinner had been quiet, but not unusually so. My parents were talking in low voices, and Charlie barely said a word, which wasn't out of the ordinary. He had always been a quiet kid, lost in his own thoughts. I didn't think much of it. I was too busy playing with my toys, too busy being a child in a world where I thought monsters only lived under the bed. When I heard the first shot, I froze in my room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with questions. Was it a firecracker? A car backfiring? But then came the second shot, and I knew. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. I crept out of my room, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stay. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before, stretching out like a tunnel into the unknown. I could hear my mother's voice, but it wasn't her usual tone. It was panicked, pleading. When I reached the living room, I saw her first. She was on the floor, clutching her stomach, blood pooling around her. My father was slumped against the wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow. And then there was Charlie, standing there with the gun in his hand. He wasn't my brother anymore. The look in his eyes, it's something I'll never forget. They weren't angry or sad or scared. They were empty, as if he was looking through us, not at us. It was as if the Charlie I knew was gone, replaced by someone, or something, I didn't recognize. He turned toward me then, and for a second, I thought it was all over. I was next. I could see it in the way his grip tightened on the gun, the way his body tensed. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and my voice was caught somewhere deep in my throat. But then something happened. The gun jammed. I didn't know it at the time, but that small mechanical failure saved my life. Charlie stared at it for a moment, as if confused, before his expression shifted into something I can only describe as frustration. That was my chance, and somehow, I found the strength to run. I don't remember how I got outside or how long I stood there, shaking and crying in the cold night air. The neighbors came, their faces a mix of concern and confusion as they tried to make sense of my sobs. Someone called the police, and soon the house was flooded with flashing lights and the sound of hurried voices. The officers found Charlie sitting on the floor, the gun beside him. He didn't resist, didn't try to run or explain himself. He just sat there, silent and expressionless, as if he didn't understand what he had done, or maybe he didn't care. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. This was Charlie, my brother, the person who was supposed to protect me. How could he do something like this? How could he take away the person who had given us life, who had loved him unconditionally? I couldn't comprehend it. I didn't want to. The Charlie I knew, the Charlie I loved, couldn't be the same person who had done this. But as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, the truth was staring me in the face. My brother had destroyed our family. The hardest part wasn't the fear or the shock, it was the loss. Losing my mother was devastating, but losing the image of Charlie as my protector, my hero, was almost worse. It was like losing two people at once. I wanted to believe that there was an explanation, some reason for what he had done, but no one could give me one. Not the police, not the doctors, not even Charlie himself. And that, more than anything, haunted me. It's been years, but that night is still with me, like a shadow I can't escape. The sound of the gunshots, the look in his eyes, the feeling of my world crumbling around me, they're all burned into my memory, a constant reminder of the night everything changed. If you're drawn to uncovering the hidden truths behind real-life crimes, subscribe to Vick's Veil of Justice. Be part of a community that explores some of the most chilling and thought-provoking true crime stories. Tap the subscribe button and enable notifications to ensure you never miss a story that deserves to be told. After that horrific night, our lives were shattered, and the pieces seemed impossible to gather. The immediate aftermath was a blur of police lights, hushed conversations, and the sterile walls of the hospital where my father fought for his life. Amidst the chaos, there was one question that loomed over us all. What would become of Charlie? Given his age, just 13 at the time, the justice system viewed him as a juvenile, a child who had committed an unthinkable act. He was placed in a psychiatric hospital, a decision that left me torn between relief and confusion. Relief that he was away from us, that we were safe, but confusion over what this meant for our family's future. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Charlie remained in the hospital, undergoing evaluations and treatments that were never fully explained to me. I was young, and the adults around me spoke in guarded tones, shielding me from the full reality of the situation. But even in my youth, I understood that something was deeply wrong, that our family had been irrevocably altered. After a year, Charlie was released. Just 1 year for taking our mother's life, for attempting to take our father's and mine. The brevity of his confinement was a decision made by the authorities, influenced by his age and the belief in rehabilitation. But to me, it felt like a betrayal, a dismissal of the pain and fear that had become a constant in our lives. Adding to the complexity was the fact that Charlie's juvenile records were sealed. This legal action, intended to protect his future, meant that the details of his crime were hidden from public view. Our family was left in a silence that was both imposed and self-inflicted. We didn't speak of that night, didn't address the lingering shadows that haunted our home. It was as if by not acknowledging it, we could pretend it never happened. But the silence was suffocating. I struggled with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, sorrow. I wanted to forgive Charlie, to find a way to move forward, but every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the mother I would never see again, the innocence that had been stolen from me. Forgiveness is a complex emotion, especially when the person you're trying to forgive is someone you once loved deeply. I grappled with this daily, the internal battle between the desire to heal and the inability to forget. How could I forgive someone who had shattered my world, who had taken so much from me? Our family tried to piece together a semblance of normalcy, but the cracks were always there, just beneath the surface. We avoided certain topics, tiptoed around memories that were too painful to confront. Charlie's presence was a constant reminder of that night, and while he seemed to move forward, I remained trapped in the past, unable to escape the shadows of our shared history. In the end, the silence did more harm than good. By not addressing the trauma, by not seeking the help we so desperately needed, we allowed the wounds to fester. And while Charlie's records may have been sealed, the memories were etched into my mind, an indelible mark that no amount of time could erase. Looking back, I realized that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing the harm done. It's about finding a way to live with the past, to acknowledge the pain, and to choose to move forward despite it. But at that time, I wasn't ready. I was still that frightened girl in the hallway, staring into the eyes of a brother I no longer recognized, searching for answers that would never come. For years, it seemed like Charlie had changed. After he was released from the psychiatric hospital as a teenager, life took on a strange new rhythm. He finished school, got a job, and eventually built a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. He got married to Terry, a kind and loving woman who seemed to bring out the best in him. Together, they lived in Florida, where he worked as a radar technician. By all accounts, Charlie appeared to have moved on. But for me, there was always something lingering beneath the surface, something that I couldn't quite name. Every time I saw him, there was a part of me that remembered, not just what he had done, but how he had looked that night. That emptiness in his eyes. That cold, detached calm. It was impossible to forget, no matter how much time had passed. Charlie had a way of making people feel at ease. He was polite, soft-spoken, even charming at times. He had this ability to blend into the background, to become the kind of person you wouldn't look twice at. But that was part of what unsettled me. He was too good at being invisible, too good at making you forget who he really was. As the years went on, little things started to stand out. Subtle, almost imperceptible red flags that would have been easy to overlook if you didn't know his past. His fascination with anatomy, for instance, never really went away. Terry would occasionally mention how he liked to watch medical documentaries or read books about surgery. She thought it was a harmless quirk, maybe even a sign of intellectual curiosity. But I knew better. There was something too intense about the way he talked about it, the way his eyes would light up when the subject came up. It reminded me of those afternoons in the backyard when he'd spend hours dissecting animals, completely absorbed in his work. Back then, it had been written off as a childish fascination. But now, as an adult, it felt darker. Charlie also had a way of keeping people at arm's length. Even with Terry, he seemed distant. He loved her in his own way, I'm sure of that, but there was always a part of him that seemed unreachable. He didn't open up easily, didn't share his thoughts or feelings the way most people do. It was like there was a wall around him, one that no one, not even his wife, could break through. Sometimes, when we were together at family gatherings, I'd catch him staring off into the distance, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the kind of absent-mindedness you'd expect from someone lost in thought. It was something else, something colder. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that I was just projecting my fears onto him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Terry adored him. She believed in him, trusted him. She saw a side of Charlie that I never could, and for her sake, I wanted to believe that he had changed. But every time I saw him, there was a part of me that couldn't forget. Looking back now, I realize how easy it was for Charlie to wear the mask of normalcy. He was careful, methodical, always in control. He knew how to hide in plain sight, how to make people see only what he wanted them to see. But underneath that facade was the same darkness that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And eventually, it did. The signs were there all along, subtle as they were. His distant personality, his fascination with anatomy, the way he kept people at a safe emotional distance, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. But by the time the truth finally came to light, it was too late to stop what was coming. If you're captivated by uncovering the hidden truths behind real-life crimes, don't forget to subscribe to Vick's Veil of Justice. Join our community as we delve into the most chilling and thought-provoking true crime stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be told. In early September 2004, as Hurricane Ivan threatened the Florida Keys, Charlie Brandt and his wife, Terry, decided to evacuate their home in Big Pine Key. Seeking refuge, they turned to their niece, Michelle Jones, who graciously opened her Orlando home to them. Michelle, a successful television executive, was known for her warmth and hospitality, and she welcomed her aunt and uncle without hesitation. The initial days of their stay were uneventful. The trio spent time together, sharing meals and conversations, attempting to maintain normalcy despite the looming storm. Michelle kept in regular contact with her mother, Mary Lou, and friends, updating them on the situation and her guests. However, subtle tensions began to surface. On the evening of September 13th, Michelle mentioned to a friend, Lisa Emmons, that the Brandts had an argument after drinking, leading her to discourage Lisa from visiting that night. As the night progressed, an unimaginable horror unfolded within the walls of Michelle's home. In a sudden and brutal act, Charlie attacked his wife, Terry, stabbing her multiple times in the chest as she lay on the couch. The assault was swift and lethal, leaving Terry with no chance to defend herself. Charlie then turned his attention to Michelle. The details of the attack are both gruesome and chilling. Michelle was decapitated, her head placed beside her body. She was also disemboweled, with several internal organs, including her heart, removed. The level of mutilation indicated a familiarity with human anatomy, suggesting that this act was premeditated and executed with precision. The following day, concerned about the uncharacteristic silence from Michelle, her friend Debbie Knight decided to check on her. Upon arrival, Debbie found the front door locked and received no response to her calls. Determined to ensure her friend's safety, she attempted to enter through the garage. It was there that she made the first horrifying discovery: Charlie's lifeless body hanging from the rafters, an apparent suicide by hanging. Debbie immediately contacted the authorities. When law enforcement arrived and entered the home, they were met with a scene of unimaginable brutality. Terry's body was found on the couch, bearing multiple stab wounds. Michelle's mutilated remains were discovered in her bedroom, the extent of the injuries indicating a deeply disturbed perpetrator. The weapons used in the murders were identified as knives from Michelle's own kitchen, suggesting that Charlie had utilized readily available tools to commit these heinous acts. The news of the murders and Charlie's suicide sent shockwaves through the family and the community. For those who knew Charlie, it was a jarring revelation that the man they believed had overcome his violent past had, in fact, harbored a darkness that ultimately consumed him and led to the tragic loss of 2 innocent lives. When I heard what he did, it felt like the nightmare was happening all over again. The memories of our mother's death, the suppressed fears, all came rushing back with a force that was both overwhelming and paralyzing. I realized then that the darkness inside Charlie never went away. It only grew, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to reveal itself in the most horrific way imaginable. In the aftermath, investigators delved deeper into Charlie's past, uncovering disturbing evidence that suggested these were not isolated incidents. His fascination with human anatomy, his collection of surgical books and autopsy photos, and his frequent visits to websites depicting violence against women painted a portrait of a man deeply obsessed with death and mutilation. Further investigations linked him to other unsolved murders, revealing a pattern that had gone unnoticed for decades. The tragic events of that night in 2004 not only ended the lives of Terry and Michelle, but also shattered the illusion that Charlie Brandt had been rehabilitated. It exposed the grim reality that the horrors of the past had been a prelude to even greater atrocities, leaving a trail of grief, confusion, and unanswered questions for those of us left behind. In the wake of the tragic events involving my brother, Charlie, the investigation took a harrowing turn. As authorities delved deeper into his past, they began to uncover unsettling connections to other unsolved murders. One such case was that of Sherry Parisho, a 38-year-old woman whose partially clothed body was discovered near the North Pine Channel Bridge at Big Pine Key on July 16, 1989. Her throat had been slashed, and her head was nearly severed, a gruesome act reminiscent of the brutality inflicted upon Michelle. Disturbingly, Sherry's body was found less than 1,000 feet from where Charlie lived at the time. Witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Charlie's description near the scene on the night of the murder. Based on this evidence, Monroe County investigators officially closed the case in 2006, attributing the crime to Charlie. As the investigation expanded, authorities identified over 20 unsolved cases throughout Florida that bore striking similarities to Charlie's known crimes. The meticulous nature of the mutilations, particularly the removal of hearts, suggested a disturbing pattern. Even international law enforcement agencies, including those in Germany and the Netherlands, reached out about similarities in savage murder cases that had long remained unsolved. The realization that Charlie might have been a serial killer operating undetected for decades was a chilling revelation. It forced me to confront the possibility that the brother I thought I knew had been hiding a monstrous darkness all along. Reflecting on these discoveries, a haunting question lingers in my mind. How many lives could have been saved if someone had stopped him sooner? The signs, though subtle, were there. But in our desire to move past the horrors of the past, did we overlook the warning signals that could have prevented further tragedy? The weight of this realization is a burden I carry daily. It's a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to confront uncomfortable truths, no matter how deeply they may be buried. As I grapple with these reflections, one question remains unanswered, casting a shadow over my thoughts. Were there other victims, other lives cut short by Charlie's hidden darkness, that we may never know about? Charlie wasn't just my brother, he was my greatest fear. Growing up, I believed in the bond we shared, the unbreakable connection of family. But that belief was shattered, first when he took my mother's life, and again years later, when I learned about the horrors he unleashed on his wife, Terry, and my niece Michelle. I survived his rampage, but his shadow will haunt me forever. It's not just the memories of what he did, but the haunting realization that I didn't see it coming. That none of us did. I've spent years asking myself, could I have done something? Could anyone? Or was Charlie's darkness something that no one could stop, a force that lay dormant until it was too late? The questions never go away. They linger in quiet moments, in the spaces where the silence feels too loud. How many lives did Charlie take? How many people suffered because we didn't see what was right in front of us? But this isn't just about Charlie. It's about all the warning signs we ignore, the uncomfortable truths we bury because they don't fit into the narrative we want to believe. It's about the systems that failed to recognize the danger he posed, the opportunities missed to prevent unimaginable pain. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we can't afford to look away. We can't ignore the signs or assume that someone else will step in. Because sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers or the unknown. It comes from the people we think we know best. So, I leave you with this question. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? How often do we take comfort in the masks they wear, in the stories they tell us, without ever looking deeper? Think about that the next time you look at someone you trust. And ask yourself, if the unthinkable were to happen, would you have seen it coming? Let's not just reflect on these tragedies. Let's act. Share your thoughts in the comments. Talk about what warning signs you've seen, what you've learned from this story. Because by speaking up, by staying vigilant, we might just prevent the next Charlie Brandt from hiding in plain sight. Thank you for listening to this story. Stay safe, stay aware, and always trust your instincts.